We're bringing in Ihor Chalenko, political scientist and chairman of the Center for Analysis and Strategy, to join the discussion. Hello, Ihor. Good evening. We're glad to see you. So, Zelensky has asked Trump for Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of over 1,600 kilometers. The armed forces of Ukraine will consider the Kremlin as a target for attack. This is reported by The Telegraph. Allegedly, during a closed-door meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, Zelensky asked his American counterpart to provide precisely this type of missile. It's interesting, by the way, that Zelensky recently also gave an interview to an American publication and said that he asked Donald Trump for certain weapons systems, though he didn't specify which ones, that would not be used by the armed forces of Ukraine against Russia, but would hint to Russia that it shouldn't get too bold. What do you think? Did such a conversation actually take place? So far, this information hasn't been confirmed, but still.
In fact, there's absolutely no real need for any confirmation here, especially since the significant topic of Tomahawk missiles has indeed come up multiple times before. Let me kindly remind you that in September of last year, a comprehensive victory plan was officially presented, where one of the crucial points was deliberately classified, but it was precisely within this particular point that Ukraine formally made a specific and important request. To then President Biden and to the two presidential candidates, Trump and their prominent counterparts, specifically Harris and the distinguished lady, regarding precisely how Ukraine could actually be decisively defeated. Now, a year has passed. We're in September again, almost a year since that plan was presented, and once more we're returning to the topic of Tomahawks. This precisely indicates with undeniable clarity that in the crucial 9 months directly following Donald Trump's presidential inauguration, his persistent efforts to actively encourage Vladimir Putin to sit down at the negotiating table with Ukraine were regrettably entirely unsuccessful. And as we profoundly understand, Tomahawk missiles are a very serious and significant factor of direct and impactful influence. Of course, it should be particularly noted that these powerful weapons are mainly sea-launched missiles deployed from naval vessels, but there is also the possibility of launching them from aircraft. Obviously, no one is going to give us such aircraft. There is also the possibility of launching them from ground-based platforms, for example, the Mk-41. By the way, these ground-based launchers are deployed on the territory of Poland. And that's why this is very interesting, and in principle, it meets the necessary requirements. In fact, it's not even 1,600 kilometers, but up to 2,500. However, it is also crucial to acknowledge that during the intense and protracted conflict between Israel and Iran, the American forces extensively utilized, among various advanced weaponry, their highly effective Tomahawk cruise missiles, which unequivocally demonstrated their remarkable precision and devastating capabilities throughout the engagements. Against air defense systems that were in fact of Russian manufacture, and that's why this is a very serious and painful issue for the Russians. But we should also understand and view this as a continuation of the rhetoric, for example, of Trump, where he completely shifted towards Ukraine, expressing confidence that we can to reclaim all our territories by military means and so on. In other words, all of this should really be seen as new levers of influence directly on Putin. And as for how much time Putin is being given to think things over, well, as Trump himself said, a month. If you look at the calendar, check the announcements, you'll see that everything coincides with the ASEAN summit, which will be held in Malaysia in October, and both Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping are expected to meet there.
Again, referring to this interview Vladimir Zelensky gave to Axios, I want to ask you about a few of his quotes. First, he says that Trump wants Ukraine to win. Second, if we cannot regain the territories by force, we are ready to reclaim them through diplomatic means in the future. Trump realized that Putin will not bring him success. The American people do not trust Putin. The support of the American people is very important to Trump. Ukraine is not losing the war, but it is not winning either. That's true. We do not have enough weapons and air defense systems, says the Ukrainian president. Tell me, please, does this really reflect what is going on in Trump's mind? Does he really want Ukraine to win, for example? And that Putin and cooperating with him will not bring him success?
Honestly, I truly do not think that we can effectively squeeze out and completely drive this deep-seated Russophilia out of Donald Fredovich's head. He still demonstrably has it when it specifically comes to his overall attitude toward Vladimir Putin, But now there are very real and pressing circumstances as the crucial start of the upcoming election campaign is rapidly approaching. Directly in the United States, regarding the midterm elections, and at the same time, the House of Representatives will be up for re-election, and a third of the Senate will be elected as well. Even though this will happen in November of next year, for them it all starts a year in advance, so they are constantly living in this pre-election rush. But nevertheless, that's one of the points. The second point, Trump's change in position right now stands out especially clearly and prominently on the critical issue of Palestine. When many Western countries, including key European nations, recognize the independence and sovereignty of Palestine, while Israel and the United States are firmly on the other side of this complex and deeply divisive issue, Trump needs to carefully demonstrate the essential unity of the Western world, a crucial diplomatic challenge. And the issue of Ukraine is the best option to overshadow certain problems on the Palestinian track while still demonstrating this unity on the topic of Ukraine. And in principle, Trump has partially succeeded in this. Plus, there's also the question of ratings, not just in terms of approval ratings, but also public opinion polls in the United States, which show that Americans in general consider Trump's actions on our case to be insufficient and not decisive enough. That's why all of this is now transforming into what we are seeing. By the way, I would note that a very telling example is the change in position, not even of Trump himself, but of Vice President Pence, who, as we remember, held a more cautious, a definitive position regarding us. But nevertheless, he has now, as widely expected, fully and unequivocally supported Trump and clearly voiced clarification regarding which specific and crucial points the Russian Federation is absolutely and fundamentally dissatisfied with in terms of the proposed peace agreement. He will say this just shows that the states are still trying to accelerate the achievement of peace. Although regarding the topic of communication with the Russian Federation, it's clear that they won't be dismissing this issue. At the very least, we know that in the coming days, another visit to Moscow is supposed to take place. The main thing here is that we don't end up going in circles again, where after a very pro-Ukrainian stance in the morning, everything suddenly shifts back to the Kremlin's position by the evening. Of course, in the morning, they speak from the position of the American president.
Now let's talk a bit more about Trump. Although I also want to discuss Lavrov's absolutely outrageous statement later, but that's interesting too. Trump stated that he is ready to lift sanctions against Turkey and allow the sale of F-35 fighter jets if Ankara refuses to buy Russian oil. So, after meeting with Erdogan, Trump announced all this and emphasized the importance of Turkey refusing Russian oil under the conditions of war. You know, on the one hand, it all sounds great and wonderful, but on the other hand, can Turkey really go for this incentive? We'll get F-35s from the United States if we stop buying super cheap Russian oil. Is this really an equivalent offer on the scales?
Well, here too, it's not also absolutely clear-cut. Not everything is simply black and white or strictly binary, for one very significant and compelling reason. In fact, when we carefully observe these particular statements, at precisely the same time, the Americans and the Turks officially signed a substantial and long-term contract for the crucial supply of, for example, American liquefied natural gas, more commonly known as LNG, specifically addressing the critical gas issue. Over the extensive course of the next 20 years, they are contractually obligated to receive a substantial volume of 4 billion cubic meters of this essential liquefied gas annually, ensuring a consistent and reliable energy source for their needs. This is equivalent to approximately about 70 billion cubic meters of natural pipeline gas. Accordingly, this significant development is already a very serious and substantial blow to, at the very least, a considerable part of the which was currently and directly under the administration of the Russian Federation, specifically located in Turkey. Therefore, in this case, certain work is being done. As for the fighter jets themselves, of course, we absolutely need to carefully watch the further subsequent reaction of the Turkish authorities, but as we can clearly see, Turkey is now definitively leaning away from actively pursuing and purchasing these particular aircraft. American fighter jets, both highly advanced 4th and 5th generation models, and the nation is actively moving toward acquiring and buying powerful engines for aircraft of its own domestic production. And furthermore, So in other words, what is really needed here is an engine specifically for Turkish aircraft. So we'll have to see how things develop. Plus, we can see that the F-35 has now lost support among European buyers due to recent scandals, such as when certain elements in the F-16S were disabled for Ukrainians, and this was perceived extremely negatively by many potential buyers of the F-35 itself as a fifth-generation aircraft.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
And in general, it seems, after the statement by Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, that the North Atlantic Alliance cannot afford to shoot down Russian drones worth a few $1,000s with million-dollar missiles. Well, that's certainly true. But let's discuss something else as well. Another outrageous statement from Sergei Lavrov at the G20 summit at the level of foreign ministers. He stated that, so I want to quote him directly here, NATO and the European Union, through Ukraine, have declared a real war on Russia and are directly participating in it. And he claimed that the crisis in Ukraine was provoked by the collective West, and that right now a serious war is being waged against Russia. Who is he even saying this to? Do these excuses still work for anyone? I want to ask you, even from the perspective of the tool that voices Lavrov's words.
In reality, all of this is now primarily and increasingly aimed more directly at the domestic Russian audience, because they desperately need to comprehensively explain why there is currently a significant and ongoing fuel crisis and a number of other pressing and severe problems directly affecting the everyday lives of ordinary Russians. So it's not merely a war of Russia against Ukraine. No, it's supposedly a much broader and more insidious war of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, directly against the sovereign Russian Federation itself. And in addition, it's also kind of, let's say, this is a very clear and unambiguous signal to Western countries, representing a significant threat indeed, a threat that this kind of rhetoric could escalate into something bigger. So it's another element of hybrid aggression. This time in terms of information and psychological special operations, which the Russian Federation is actively using right now, especially in recent weeks.
And what do you think about the statement that Europe is not responsible for helping Ukraine? Trump promised to stop the killing, so it can't be our fault. America is NATO's greatest ally. That's what Kaja Kallas, the EU's chief diplomat, says. Well, to be honest, that's a strange statement. Is Ukraine being tossed around like a hot potato between the US and Europe right now? Or is it just me?
I didn't view Ms. Kallas's statement so reactively for one simple reason. A certain message was already being spread through some Western media, supposedly that Trump is washing his hands of the matter. This happened right after that well-known post on Truth Social and a series of statements at the UN General Assembly. And also a number of politicians also interpreted it as if the United States is withdrawing from actively supporting Ukraine, but in actual reality, they are certainly not going anywhere. They have just strategically shifted their primary focus to a more commercial basis. The only significant thing is, of course, that Ms. Kallas genuinely wants to see this critical situation not only from the important perspective of being the European Union's high representative, but also, very importantly, as a dedicated representative of the Baltic states, which are now, in undeniable fact, positioned directly on the front line of the serious and escalating threat posed, among many others, by the aggressive Russian Federation. Therefore, this is also certainly a very deliberate attempt to get a much clearer and more comprehensive political course of action from Washington regarding this particular issue. But again, I personally do not think that this specific statement is extremely definitive or conclusive at this point in time. So incredibly resonant, and it's abundantly clear that this is a concerted attempt to preserve transatlantic unity on the crucial issue of steadfastly supporting Ukraine, where the United States still absolutely needs to play a significant and pivotal role, both right now and in the foreseeable future, regarding comprehensive security guarantees for Ukraine in the critical post-war period.
Here, Orban essentially staged a démarche, saying that giving up Russian oil and gas would bring Hungary to its knees. Orban claims that if Hungary is cut off from these supplies, its GDP will shrink by 4% and things will get very bad. I don't even know what to say to our viewers about this. How should we interpret this? It seems like Orban He's basically a direct agent of Trump in the European Union. He has always boasted about this, and everyone has said so. But now he's saying, no, we won't do this, even though it's the main demand of the American president. What does this indicate?
Actually, by the way, this is a certain and significant problem when a political figure like Donald Trump doesn't possess enough crucial information about essential supply routes, for example, for a nation such as Hungary and so on, which could have serious implications. Orban actively manipulates this particular situation since he consistently claims that they genuinely have no other viable supply routes available and can therefore only exclusively use Russian oil for their energy needs. And supposedly the economy would collapse by 4% because of this. And what about the Adriatic route? Why doesn't he mention that? Technically, right now, through Croatia, there is indeed the distinct possibility of supplying oil, by the way, American oil specifically, and directly to Hungary and Slovakia. That is, it's possible to fully 100% meet the current demand, but Orban doesn't talk about that. Orban starts to manipulate things, claiming that supposedly hundreds of thousands of ordinary Hungarian families will suffer. It would be simply terrible. This conversation needs to be steered in a constructive direction. How so? Here's the current problem. Indeed, Croatia has significantly raised the transit tariff for oil through its territory to a rate that is 5 times higher than the general European rate, a substantial increase. To effectively resolve this significant issue, it's abundantly clear that the influential position of the United States or other relevant international intermediaries could be strategically utilized if Croatia, for any reason, does not ultimately agree to the proposed terms or solutions. But this is already a matter of business management. In fact, regarding Croatia specifically, this isn't even a geopolitical issue right now. And this particular situation can be readily resolved if Hungary genuinely ensures the contracted volumes of gas transit directly through this specific and viable alternative route. But Hungary and Orban himself do not want to do this. They want to continue relying accordingly on Russian oil. And by the way, also on Russian gas, which is still being supplied through the Turk Stream pipeline. But regarding the Turk Stream and gas, there are actually no real problems here either, because based on the topic we discussed earlier, we now see how Turkey itself, in fact, through the existing infrastructure, and it will have even more opportunities, can provide the same possibilities for gas pipelines and the Balkan Stream simply by transporting but not Russian gas. And this can also be done with the involvement of those same LNG terminals. Therefore, this actually clearly shows that Viktor Orban and obviously Robert Fico along with him are much more constructive in actively going for this important cooperation, diligently signing contracts right now and fostering stronger ties. And specifically with the Americans or with others, they can choose whom to work with and to use the capacities that have already been built. By the way, let me remind you, Hungary has already signed a contract with Shell for the continuous supply of approximately 2 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, every single year for a period of 10 consecutive years. So accordingly, we understand that this is already about 35 billion cubic meters of gas in pipeline equivalent. In other words, this means that the Hungarians already have a serious alternative. So why are they now opposing the rejection of Russian oil and gas? Well, it's absurd. It really is absurd.
You see, it's important to understand the context. You've explained it, and in fact, the situation has become much clearer. Thank you very much. Ihor Chalenko, political scientist and chairman of the Center for Analysis and Strategy, was on the air with Ukraine Today. All the best.
Thank you.